Well, I'm greatly honored to be invited here as your keynote speaker tonight for this California Academy of Sciences and Exploratorium event. I'd like to thank Catherine for organizing things and thank Roberta for showing me around and thank all the people that showed me back behind the scenes. I got to look at the entomology collection and see some real gee whiz specimens. And I wanted to say that I was at the Cal Academy shortly after the renovation, and I was here as a tourist like anybody else. And so it's quite an honor to be here as the invited speaker. Now, I gather that you interns are interested in how I got where I am today and what it is that I do. Well, in a way, I am too, because I'm not where I expected to be at this point in my career, at least when I was in college. And I haven't really thought that much about how I got where I am today until working on this talk. And I realized there were some unusual zigs and zags along the way. And so what I want to do is talk about how I got interested in what I do and talk a little bit about my educational pathway, and then tell you a little bit about what my day is like where I work at the University of Kansas. So, beginning at the beginning, in the words of Bill Cosby, I started out as a child. One of my biggest childhood influences was that I loved to read, and my parents read to me when I was little, and we went to the library, every week or two as I was growing up. And I read all different kinds of things. I lived in a small town, and I kind of exhausted some of the youth shelves in that library. I read mysteries, I read science fiction, I went through different phases, adventures, war stories. I still read for relaxation. If I have some downtime, I really like to sit down with a book. I read everything from novels and science fiction to aviation history and biographies. And I want to say, as an educator, from my perspective, I've learned over many years that if you want to write, you need to read. And my experience is that my students who are good writers are uniformly the students that also read a lot. Doesn't matter what you read. You don't have to read Shakespeare, you can read Harlequin romances, you can read graphic novels. But if you want to be a good writer, you really have to read. And if you do read, then writing will be much easier for you. Of course, in my generation, reading means things in print, books, magazines. I expect for a lot of you guys, when you think of reading, you might think of the internet, things on the web, blogs, or heaven forbid, Twitter. I have some reservations about what passes for writing on the web. Yes, there are well-written blogs, there are good web pages, but there's also a lot of junk out there. And later on in my talk, when I talk about some of the research aspects of background reading for my textbook, I'll talk a little bit, or not my textbook, but the book that Meg mentioned. I'll talk a little bit about separating the wheat from the chaff as far as the writing on the web is concerned. Now, another major influence on me as I was growing up is that I grew up in a little town outside of Dayton, Ohio. And whoops, how did that happen? I grew up in a little town outside of Dayton, Ohio, and my grandparents actually lived about a 5 or 10 minute bus ride from this house. This is the house that Orville and Wilbur Wright lived in when they were inventing the airplane. Dayton, Ohio is also the home of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is a large, important Air Force base, and it's also the home of the Air Force Museum, which is the official museum of the U.S. Air Force. And my father worked at the Air Force Base, and there were always airplanes flying over our house as I was growing up. And back then, you could occasionally even hear sonic booms because it was it was legal for airplanes to fly faster than the speed of sound over the US at that time. And so flight was all around me, and I periodically went to the Air Force Museum. I convinced my father to set up a dark room and teach me photo processing back in the days before digital cameras, when you had to spend hours in the dark room to get a photo, so that I could do my own enlargements of pictures of airplanes that I had taken at the Air Force Museum. So in short, I became kind of an airplane nut. Another significant influence on me as I was growing up was the ocean. My family took several vacations to the Gulf Coast of Florida as I was in my elementary school years, and I discovered there that I love the ocean, I love the beach, I love the animals underwater on the beach. I loved boats and being around boats and going out on boats. And I love going in the water, which is a whole lot more comfortable and convenient than going around in the water around here. And so I just really fell in love with the ocean. And sometime in my elementary school years, somebody gave me a book about ocean science. And I read that book, and combining that with our visits to Florida when I was a child, I announced at that time that I was going to be an oceanographer when I grew up. I don't think I really knew what an oceanographer did at that time, but it had something to do with the ocean, and that's what I wanted to do. So now if we jump ahead a few years, in high school, I liked science. I've always liked science, and I discovered that the science that I really liked the most was biology. And so I had oceanography in the back of my mind still, and I thought, well, you know, if you combine that, that's biological oceanography, and so that's what I want to do. And I kind of thought of oceanography and marine biology as the same thing, and it turns out they're not, and I'll tell you some of the ways that that affected my career path. So here's the situation. I'm getting ready to apply to colleges. You've got this fairly bright, very stubborn, quite uninformed high school student who's dealing with a counselor who probably should have retired a few years earlier, and at least as far as science was concerned, was fairly clueless. And so that meant I pretty much had to come up with my own criteria for choosing a college or university. And looking back on it, my criteria were amusingly naive. And let me tell you what my criteria were. So I thought I was interested in biological oceanography, so I wanted to go to some college or university that had a biological oceanography program. Pretty straightforward. Now, in my notes it says everyone knows that if you're a biology major, then you just go to med school. And the reason I have that in my notes is because I've met tons and tons of college students who think that. If you're a biology major, you like biology, you should go to med school. So my second criteria was the university should be associated with a medical school. My third criteria was that my eyes were bad. I've worn glasses since the fourth grade, so I knew I wasn't going to be able to get a job as a pilot. But a Navy recruiter had convinced me that the Navy had lots of jobs where you could work around or even in airplanes and not be a pilot. And so my third criterion was that the university should have a Navy ROTC program so that I could apply for a Navy ROTC scholarship. Now it turns out that my criteria actually could be fulfilled. There were actually institutions out there that met these criteria, and I applied to some, and I got accepted to some, and I ended up going to the University of Michigan. It turns out that my criteria were flawed. The first thing is that I got turned down for the Navy ROTC scholarship. At that time, the Navy was actually downsizing. They weren't taking very many students, and I did not get a scholarship. My med school criteria was flawed because I went to a state university as an out-of-state student, and out-of-state students almost never get into state medical schools. And anyway, it didn't really matter because at that time, you pretty much had to have about a 3.95 GPA to get into medical school, and my grades were good, but they weren't quite that good. Now, actually, I'm quite thankful for that because now, knowing several physicians, I know that I would not have wanted to be a doctor, and I don't think I would have been very good at it. Now, my third criterion was kind of a mixed blessing. I ended up at the University of Michigan in oceanography. And if you know geography, you might think Michigan is kind of a weird place to study oceanography. It turns out that it actually makes some sense because the Great Lakes are really inland seas. They're not salty, but a lot of what oceanographers do, you can do on the Great Lakes. And the University of Michigan at that time was part of the Sea Grant program, which was a large national organization of institutions studying oceanography and ocean-related things. They had an active research program going on the Great Lakes, doing oceanographic research, and they had a cooperative program with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute so that you could go to Woods Hole over the summer and take summer research courses. And those courses, some were taught by Woods Hole faculty and some were taught by University of Michigan faculty. Now, unfortunately for me, that program ran out of funding the year before I was eligible. And so what that meant was that if I wanted to have an oceanography field course, I had to figure it out on my own. And so I did some research, looked into it, and found some marine labs that had biological oceanography field courses, and one of them was Duke University Marine Lab. And so I ended up going to Duke University Marine Lab and taking a biological oceanography field course. I really enjoyed that course. I liked it a lot. I learned a lot. But one of the most important things I learned was that I really did not want to be an oceanographer. The reason that I was interested in oceanography was I thought that oceanographers lived out on these research vessels, and that's not really the way it works. Oceanographers spend most of their time analyzing data in their office and writing grant proposals because these ships are so darn expensive to operate that they write a grant and they get out on the ship for maybe a month and a half if they're lucky. They travel huge distances, taking samples as they go, and then they collect all these data points, go back to their office and spend months or years analyzing the data. And the idea is to try to figure out from these points all across, maybe a dozen points across the Pacific, something about the currents or the physical processes of that whole ocean basin. And not only that, but I discovered that biological oceanographers are interested in things like the currents and the chemical and physical properties of the ocean that affect organisms and where they can live and who lives where and that sort of thing. But they weren't really interested in the organisms themselves. And what I was interested in was the critters, where they were, how they made a living, what they did, how they worked. And it turns out that's actually marine biology, which is what I was interested in. So my time at the University of Michigan was not wasted by any means, however, I must say. My department was actually, it's kind of weird, but I was in oceanography, but that department was in the engineering school. And what that meant was that I took the same math and physics as all the engineering students. And so at the end of my career there, I had a much stronger math and physics background than the typical biology major. And this served me in good stead in grad school, where my research involved aerodynamics and fluid mechanics. Now, I went to the University of Michigan for all the wrong reasons, but I really am glad I went. I think it's a great place to go to school. I had quite a bit of culture shock, I must say, when I got there. I went to a high school of about 600, and I went to University of Michigan at that time. It had 36,000. I think they're up over 40,000 now, but 36,000 then was still somewhat overwhelming. And I kind of did what my college dorm roommates did. I didn't have to work real hard to get good grades in high school, and my dorm roommates were kind of studying the same way I had studied in high school, and I discovered that if I did that, I got C's in my science and math course at Michigan instead of A's. And so I learned that it was going to take a whole lot more work to get good grades in college than I had been doing in high school. And you might say that it was a full-time job, which I wish some of my current students really understood. I had some really excellent teachers there. I had a I had a physics teacher who just made physics seem like common sense. He made everything seem so straightforward. And I'll never forget his description of frames of reference. He was talking about different frames of reference. And so he said, imagine a speeding bullet that's got a fly standing on it. So in our frame of reference, that bullet is moving so fast you can't see it. But in the fly's frame of reference, the fly looks down at the bullet and says, no, we're at rest. So that was his description of how you could tell different frames of reference. I also had an organic chemistry professor who I thought was just excellent, but I didn't realize that all the other students thought he was just excellent as well, and at the end of the semester he got a standing ovation. I've never seen a professor get a standing ovation for a class before. He was quite good. So at the end of my undergraduate years, I was a little less naive than I had been when I was applying to college the first time around. I started looking for grad schools. I was interested in animal biology. I wanted to do something hopefully in the marine environment. And so I applied to zoology programs at universities that had marine labs. And I got accepted. And I got accepted at several, and I ended up going to Duke University. I got offers of financial support, and I wanted to take a little digression here and talk about that because a lot of my students now, undergrads, are concerned about going to grad school because a lot of them are financing their education with loans. And they think, well, if I go to grad school, I'll be taking out a whole bunch more loans and it'll be, I'll be snowed under with debt. And in fact, I wanted to point out that it is fairly common, at least in the science, it's pretty much accepted that you get some kind of assistantship along with the offer of a place in the graduate program. And so I got offered a teaching assistantship. In our department where I teach now, students aren't accepted unless there is some form of financial support involved. So don't let the thought of the finances keep you from applying to grad school because at least in the sciences, you're pretty likely to get some kind of support. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, this is hard to imagine now. I lived very comfortably on $4,000 a year when I was at Duke. That was my stipend. Of course, it was 100% tax-free back then, so that's probably equivalent to $6,000 a year now. And to give you a sense of how cheaply I was living, I actually saved enough money to take flying lessons for a semester. So, all right. I should mention that my experience in grad school was strictly in a Ph.D. program. Duke at that time did not have they didn't have a separate master's and Ph.D. program, and people rarely got masters except in unusual circumstances. Where I teach now, it's typical for a student to get a master's degree on the way to a Ph.D., but that's different from my experience, and so I'm just going to talk about the Ph.D. program, which is what I was in. Now, one of the adjustments that I had to make to grad school was that let me back up a little bit. One of the adjustments that I had to make in grad school is that in grad school the focus is much more on research and much less on courses. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense of it, the first couple years you typically take, if you're a teaching assistant, you might only take 1 or 2 courses a semester. If you're on some kind of a fellowship that doesn't involve teaching, you may take maybe 2 or 3 courses a semester. And so then you might think, well, what are you doing with the rest of that time? The rest of that time, you're expected to be taking independent studies with faculty members, learning about what they do in different labs, doing little pilot projects, and doing a lot of reading of scientific journal articles and getting up to speed in your research field. In grad school, there are 3 big milestones. There are 2 oral exams and a written work, and I want to talk about these milestones a little bit. The first oral exam, we call them preliminary exams at Duke. I've heard them other places called comprehensive exams or qualifying exams, and usually happens at the end of your second year, beginning of your third year, sometime around that time. And It's conducted by a committee of faculty members, and the faculty members are chosen by you and your advisor in consultation because they have some expertise relevant to your research, the research that you want to do. And so then you have this oral exam, and it's a big deal. It more or less determines whether you continue on in grad school, so it's not to take lightly. And typically, this exam is about half on the general field that you're in, like biology for me, and about half on the research that you want to do, or at least the area where you plan to do research. And when you pass this exam, this is an indication that the faculty says, yes, you're ready to go out and do research on your own independently. And speaking of doing independent research, if you guys haven't seen this, I highly recommend seeing if you can find a copy of it. It's probably out of print. Back in the 1960s, Vincent detour, who is a very prominent insect physiologist and behaviorist, wrote this book, To Know a Fly, and it's all about how he ended up doing research on flies and just a lot of the basics of doing research. And it's a really entertaining, funny little book. You can read it in an hour and a half. It's maybe 100 pages, large print, lots of pictures. And, but it is literally the best quick introduction to biological research that I've ever read. It's very entertaining. And there are several important points that he makes in there. And one of the most important ones is that research, scientific research, is a process of asking questions and coming up with experiments designed to answer those questions. If you're working on a fly, you can't ask the fly, does this taste sweet or not? You can't have it fill out forms. In spite of the cover picture on the cover there, you can't have a fly fill out a form and tell you whether it likes the taste of this or not. And so you have to devise experiments to figure out whether the fly likes whatever you're trying to test. And so the point is that research is all about asking questions and figuring out how to design experiments to answer those questions. Another point that he made in this book several different times is that you don't have to be a genius to be a scientist. It helps to be smart, it helps to be clever, but the most important thing is to be curious, to have a sense of curiosity. The best scientists are the people that have an intense drive to know something about some part of the natural world. And if you don't have that drive, you probably shouldn't go into science, because heaven knows we don't go into it for the money. Now, the written work that I mentioned, one of the milestones is the dissertation. Traditionally, Ph.D. students would do their research for 2 or 3 years, and then they would sit down and they would write their dissertation up all at once. And this could take anywhere from a year to, plus or minus a year. And nowadays, that's not the recommended route. Nowadays, what is recommended is that students divide their research up into little sub-projects and think of each little sub-project as like a chapter of the dissertation. But when they complete each sub-project, go ahead and write it up and submit it to a journal. And then when you get to the end of your research, most of your dissertation is already written. You just write an introduction and a conclusion and do some revising for the format, and your dissertation is 90% done. And that's what, in my area at least, that's what the majority of grad students do now. The last milestone is the dissertation defense. When the dissertation is satisfactory to your advisor, then you have to defend it. And defending it involves giving a public presentation on it and also having another of these committee oral exams. So that's the second oral exam. And in different schools, different departments have different traditions. Sometimes the defense is almost a general exam, and in some cases, in other departments, it's just on your dissertation research. But in any case, you give a presentation and your committee examines you on that, gives you an oral exam on it, and that is the culmination of your research. Now the first let's see, let me back up a little bit. In my experience, I arrived at Duke University familiar with the Marine Lab already because I had taken that summer course there. And my background was in oceanography, and this turned out to be extremely good preparation because at that time Duke University was one of the centers of biomechanics research in the country. People were doing all kinds of amazing stuff with studying how animals work, and so my background was really very appropriate for that. And so I decided I wanted to do biomechanics, and I went to the Marine Lab the first summer, and I decided to do a pilot project on sand dollars. I was interested in the locomotion and the feeding of sand dollars, and I learned a lot in that research project, and some of the things that I learned was that you don't always get real clear-cut results, and it takes practice learning how to answer how to ask questions and then frame an experiment that will give you the answers that you really want. Sometimes if you're a little bit hazy on how you set up your question, then your results come out a little hazy too. And so all grad students learn that at some point, and I was just glad that I learned that fairly early on. Another thing that I learned is that when you're working in the marine environment, everything costs twice as much and takes 3 times as long. And to give you an example, if I wanted to go out and check on my sand dollars, I had to make some measurements on sand dollars. I would have to check the tide table, see when low tide was, sign out a boat, haul all my gear down to the dock, put it in the boat, gas up the boat, motor out to the sandbar, and check the sand dollars, and then come back. And if low tide was at 5 a.m., I got up while it was still dark and went out at 5 a.m. If low tide was at 6 p.m., I skipped supper and went out at 6 p.m. You just are tied, oh, it's a bad pun, sorry, you're stuck following the tide cycles, and it can be real inconvenient sometimes. Now, in the end, this particular project didn't work out as a dissertation research project, but I did get a publication out of it in a scientific journal, but it was clear that it wasn't going to be appropriate for dissertation research. So, the next summer, I went back to the Marine Lab, and I decided that I wanted to do a research project on tunicates. Tunicates, if you aren't familiar with them, are animals that live attached to things on the bottom of the ocean. Their body is basically like a pouch that contains a filter. It's got an opening for water to come in and another opening for water to go out, and the filter is covered with cilia, and it pumps water through the filter and filters out goodies to eat. And at that time, very little was known about pumping and filtering in tunicates. And so I thought this would be a good project to look at how efficient is the filter, how much do they pump, how fast do they pump, how much does it change. And so I went to the Marine Lab and started working on a project on tunicates. And I had been at the lab for a few weeks working away, and I went to the library and just to take a break, and they had some new journals in, and I picked up a new journal and flipped through it and discovered that there was an article on the mechanics of tunicate pumping in the journal. A researcher in France had actually basically done about 3/4 of the project that I had planned to do for my work on tunicates. And so I was very depressed. This is very unusual. You hear about people getting scooped in clinical areas, but I'd never heard of anybody getting scooped in zoology before. So I was pretty depressed. I kind of half-heartedly finished up the project, and at the end of the summer, I went and talked to my advisor, Steve Vogel, and he gave me just absolutely outstanding advice. He said, you got to think about what you're really excited about. What can you get really passionate about? And we talked about it for a while, and I don't remember if it was him or me, but somehow flight came up, and I said, oh yeah, flight. I should be doing something with flight. This is silly. So that's what I did. And I had another professor, Fred Nyhout, that I had taken an independent study from, and he gave me some other really important advice. He said, when you choose your research organism, you should either choose one where you have to go somewhere really cool and exotic, like Hawaii or Australia or Tahiti or something like that, so to collect it, or you should choose one that is really abundant locally and really easy to get. And so I took his advice. I ended up doing my dissertation research on flight mechanics and maneuvering in dragonflies. Dragonflies are very abundant in North Carolina. You can collect them anytime except the middle of winter, and that turned out to be really sage advice. Now, my dissertation writing experience was a little atypical. Remember, I said that I like to read a lot, and my experience is that people that read a lot are the better writers. Well, it turned out that I wrote my dissertation, and I actually discovered that I enjoyed writing. That's very atypical. Most grad students are much more interested in the research aspect of it, or analyzing data, and actually writing it up they find much less exciting. But I actually enjoyed it, and my advisor actually mentioned, and he says this all the time, that I wrote my dissertation faster than anybody he had ever seen before. So that was kind of an unusual experience, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Now, I met my wife in grad school, and we got married just before we finished up, and she finished before I did. And so she had moved to Minnesota and was working on a temporary postdoctoral research position. And I stayed in North Carolina to finish up my dissertation. And of course, that may have had something to do with why it was so fast as well. I moved to Minnesota and took courses at the university there, and we decided that I should go ahead and start applying for jobs. And so I applied for jobs and ended up getting a job at Bellarmine College, which is a small liberal arts college in Louisville, Kentucky, which by happy coincidence was just a couple hours from where my parents lived. So that's like close enough that you can visit, but far enough away that they're not on top of you all the time. So we enjoyed that. And now, when I went to Bellarmine College, there were only 3 other faculty members there. So that meant we were teaching an entire biology curriculum plus courses for nursing students with 4 faculty members. And so that means you teach way outside your comfort zone. My background's in biomechanics with kind of a secondary emphasis in physiology. And when I was at Bellarmine, I taught Human Anatomy and Physiology 1, Human Anatomy and Physiology 2, Comparative Vertebrate Anatomy, Diversity of Organisms, and General Ecology. And none of those have very much to do with my specialization. And I never worked so hard as I worked the first couple semesters at Bellarmine College, coming up with lectures and teaching my first courses. But I must say that it gets easier. You learn shortcuts, and now I can prepare lectures for a new course in less than half the time that it took me those first couple years in Bellarmine. I really enjoyed Bellarmine. The faculty were first rate. I enjoyed working there. The students were great. But there was nothing for my wife. She had gotten a National Science Foundation grant, and so the University of Louisville had given her research space, which she was welcome to as long as she had a grant, but they had no positions. She was a plant ecologist, and they already had plant ecologists, and there wouldn't be any position available for her in the foreseeable future. And so we decided that eventually it was her turn to go on the job market. And there's a little bit of an irony there because I was in the faculty position, but I had quite a heavy teaching load, and so I wasn't applying for grants and submitting research articles as I would have been if I had been in a job with less teaching. She had no teaching. And so since she had no teaching, she was getting a lot of research done. She got another NSF grant. She was publishing a lot of papers. And we realized that she was much more marketable than I was. And so she went on the job market and actually ended up getting a couple job offers. And she got one from the University of Kansas. And she said, we're a package deal. We need to have something for both of us if you want us to come. And so we went and visited. And it turned out that they had somebody who taught their comparative physiology course just leave, and somebody who taught their anatomy course just leave. And I was teaching anatomy at Bellarmine, and I love comparative physiology. And so they said, could you do those courses? And I said, yeah, that'd be great. And so they came up with a temporary position for me that had the potential to become a permanent position later on. But unfortunately, in order for that to become a permanent position, I needed to get outside grants. And I applied many times, and I just was in the wrong place in the wrong time, and so I didn't get the outside grant support. But when the end of my temporary position came up, the university, the department chair said, look, we want you to stay, we need you to teach those courses, and we appreciate what you're doing. And so they were able to come up with a position that was a little less than full-time, and I could stay and keep doing what I was doing. And the beauty of that position actually turned out that by being in a position that wasn't full-time, I didn't have the pressure to get grants, and it gave me the freedom to explore some other things. And one of the things that I wanted to explore was writing. My advisor had kept in touch, and he suggested that I might want to try writing for a general audience. And so I took him up on that. I wrote some magazine articles, and I wrote some things for our museum, and I found that I really enjoyed it, and so he said, you know, you should think about doing a book. And so I did. And so this is my first book, Nature's Flyers, and it's about the mechanics and biology of all flying animals, whether bird, insect, bat, pterosaur, it's all covered. And I discovered that that was the most fun professionally that I had had. It was the most fun thing that I had done as a part of my work life. And so I wanted to keep it up. And so I continued on, and you know, I say this as though I just did it in 10 minutes. That was 2.5 years. And so another two or so years later, I came out with my second book, Why Don't Jumbo Jets Flap Their Wings? And this compares flying animals and aviation. Basically a comparison of how animals fly and how airplanes fly, and the differences and the similarities. And this was even more fun because this combined my work interest, which is animal flight, and my hobby interest, which is aviation. And so this was the most fun that I've ever had as something that I was doing for work. My wife is firmly convinced that nobody else in the world could have written this book. I'm not sure that that's 100% true, but it is true. There aren't very many people studying animal flight who also know a lot about aviation. And so that was great fun. I understand that some of you may be interested in how I spend my day, and so I want to tell you just a few things about the kinds of things that I do on a daily basis in my job. Rather than describe a typical day, I'll just describe some of the things that I would do over the course of several days, because as a faculty member, you don't really have a typical day. Every day is kind of different, and one of the beauties of academic positions is that you have so much flexibility. So on days when I teach, I don't teach every day. It depends on the semester. Some semesters I teach every day. This semester I'm teaching a very large course, so I only teach 3 times a week. And on days when I teach, I do a lot of course preparation. It depends on the course. Some courses I can just review my notes for a half hour and I'm good to go. But other courses, I may decide that I need to add new information. New things have come up since the last time I taught it, or I've decided that there's a better way to present it. And so it's not unusual to spend from an hour to an hour and a half revising a course, or if I'm adding new illustrations or something like that, it might take 2 hours to get ready for a lecture. I've taught courses as small as 5 students and as big as almost 500. And for me, what I've found is the bigger the course, the more effort it takes to deliver the lecture. It seems kind of weird, but there's a little element of acting. When you're trying to reach that person in the back row of the 500-seat auditorium, you put a lot more of your energy into getting your message out. And so when I'm teaching a big course like I'm doing now, I'm pretty drained afterwards, and I want to just do something fairly mindless for a while. So answer emails, prepare assignments for the future, that sort of thing. Now, the other big thing the other big chunk of time that I spend is on writing. And there's kind of two big components to that. One of those components is doing background reading, what some people call library research. And the other component is actually putting words on paper. And background research used to mean going and spending hours and hours in the library. But now, thanks to the internet, I can do all that from my desk because I can easily access most of the things that I need. I will say that the web is kind of a mixed bag. Remember back at the beginning of my talk, I said that there's some good stuff and some not so good stuff on the web. As a faculty member, I have access to, well, actually anybody in our university, students as well, has access to databases that plug us into what's called the peer-reviewed literature, which is articles and books that have that other scientists have said, yes, this is good, this is well done work, and it's reliable. Some of that is available online to anybody, but some of it you have to have a subscription. And so it's kind of, there are some journals where you can just go online and you can get the articles and it's no big deal. There are other journals where you might find a title in Google Scholar, and if you don't have access to these university databases, you might not be able to actually get the article without paying for it or something like that, or getting a subscription. So that's available online. If you don't have access to these kinds of databases, then you're kind of stuck doing it the old-fashioned way, looking up the title online and then going to a brick-and-mortar library and pulling it off the shelf and reading it. Now, there is a way to get information that is reliable and generally well-written, and that is to stick to websites of respected publications. If you find something on the New York Times website from their science section, or if you find something on the National Geographic website, you can be pretty sure that it's going to be reliable. And I say that because I've gone to websites that have beautiful pictures of plants or animals with either incorrect or misspelled scientific names, or I've gone to Wikipedia and looked up things and discovered mistakes in things in my area. So you just have to be really careful about what you trust. Wikipedia is, I love to hate Wikipedia. Wikipedia, I use it for background information all the time. It's great for just looking up something to see, you know, am I on the right track? But I would never, ever use it as a reference in my list of references in an article or a book, because it's just not reliable enough. You need to have something that you know is reliable. Now, for actual writing, I like to have at least a 2 to 4 hour block of time, and I go to the library. I want to get away from distractions. So I actually go back in the stacks and hide in the library. And I like to have a big block of time, because you'd be amazed how long it takes you to figure out what you wrote the last time you were at the library and figure out where you were going from there. And so it can take 20 to 30 minutes to get going. And then, you know, you want to have time to actually get something down. So the writing and the teaching are my two big chunks of time. There's lots of other things that I end up doing. Going to departmental committee meetings, advisory committee meetings of students, office hours, holding office hours for my classes, writing and grading exams. One of the important things that I do as a faculty member is going to departmental seminars. A departmental seminar is where somebody is invited from some other university or some research lab to come to the University of Kansas and give a talk on their research. And we have a huge department, I forget, 40 or 50 faculty members. We have an extremely diverse list of topics on these seminars. Everything from, well, recently I've seen seminars on genetics of flower colors and shapes, evolutionary relationship of shark tapeworms, evolutionary relationship of Pacific Island birds, and effects of soil microbes on the health of prairies. And so very diverse. Now, some faculty members get into this bad habit of looking at the list and saying, oh, that's not in my area, I'm not going to it. I try to go to all of them, and the reason is the best seminars that I've been to are the seminars outside my area. Those are the ones where I learn the most. And so those are the ones that you get somebody who's really excited about their area, and they just transmit that excitement, and those are the best seminars to go to. Now, my flight interests lately, I've been collaborating with some paleontologists, and some paleontologists came to me with this very peculiar fossil of this dinosaur that appeared to have flight feathers on both its front legs and its hind legs. And so we actually developed a research project to try to figure out how they use those flight feathers on the front legs and the hind legs. And unfortunately, I'm probably over my time now, so I can't go into the details on that. I'm happy if we have some informal time and you want to ask questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that later. So instead of becoming an oceanographer, I live as far as it's possible to be in the United States from the ocean. I live a short drive from the geographic center of the continental United States. As a kid, I loved science, and I just assumed I would end up in some job that involved, just doing research. And instead, I'm in a job where I mostly do teaching and writing. I do some research. My students tell me that I'm pretty good as a teacher. I had a student come up to me in New Orleans one time in the French Quarter and said, "Man, I loved your course when I took it." So I had no idea as a kid how much I would enjoy writing, and so I guess it all worked out for the best. It's very different from where I thought I would be even when I was in college. So. So, do we have questions, or?
Is there any, maybe take a couple of questions for first item? Sure. You have to guess how many years would you say you were in school? What? If you had to guess, how many years would you say you were in school?
Well, I shouldn't have to guess. So the question is how long I was in school. I'm still in school. When you're in academics, you're a student forever, and I really do. It's a funny thing. When you're a professor, the students always stay the same age, and so it's always a shock to me when I look in the mirror and see that I'm not the same age as my students. So it doesn't feel like I've actually left school. It's kind of a funny thing to say, but that's academics. Good question.
Any other questions? Yeah, we have a question actually up front.
How long, or I'm sorry, how do you think, I'm sorry, I lost it. It was about your book.
There's somebody in back.
Yeah. Are you going to come out with another book?
Am I going to come out with another book? You're darn right. I'm working on two right now. I'm trying to find a publisher. I haven't found a publisher that I haven't found the right publisher yet. But yeah, I've got one. I don't want to talk about it yet because I kind of feel like it's bad luck, actually. But yeah, I really enjoy writing, and so yeah, that's where most of my time, my non-teaching time, goes these days. Yeah.
So for your first two books, when you're writing the book, how much of it would you say is already completed in your research as far as pulling in more information to complete the book, and what you're, what you're.
You mean how much of my research is in the book as opposed to how much is new after the research? Is that what you're going to?
Like when you decide to write the book, I'm guessing you continue to research
Well, my specific, the research that I do in my lab is a minuscule part of what's in my book. And so, but I will say that the books actually led me into new areas of research. The whole paleontology thing, the reason that the paleontologist contacted me was because of my book. And so that is, you know, the aerodynamics of feathered dinosaurs is pretty different from insect flight. And it's because of the book. So they kind of feed on each other. But the book is hugely more general than what my actual scientific research is on.
And you pull from other people's work?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
You have one last question?
My question is, like, what's your best advice for someone in high school with an interest in science, the kind of the place you were in when you were in high school?
Best advice for somebody who's in high school at the place that I was when I was looking at colleges. Well, one thing that I did not do was I didn't visit any colleges, and I wish I had, because I visited several of them after I was already in college, and I might have ended up somewhere else. You know, my advice is to again, try to think of what you're excited about. What can you get enthusiastic about? And then there's so much information available on university websites now that, you know, find a place that has what you're really excited about. And, you know, as an undergrad, you don't really have the ability to really focus in on detailed area like insect flight. You wouldn't be able to do insect flight as an undergrad unless you just happen to come to KU and work in my lab. Yeah, think about the areas that you can get excited about, and then find the universities or colleges that have those kinds of areas. And the web is just a wonderful resource for that. I was doing it all by sending away for college catalogs, which is an enormous waste of paper.
Well, let's see if Dr. Oakes. We will definitely have afterward for them to come and ask you for the question.
Okay.